Captain Marc Henegar, who will moderate this panel, serves as ALPA's Air Traffic Services Group Chair, and he's being joined by ATC subject matter experts from government and industry to discuss the impact of technical and procedural changes across the national airspace system and how pilots and controllers safely manage them. Marc has the unenviable position of being the only thing left between us and a really wonderful evening. So,
hey, wait a minute. Paul Rinaldi's going to be here.
Well,
don't shortchange him.
Yeah, well, it wasn't intended that way. You all set?
Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. It's all yours.
Well, good afternoon. We appreciate your time and attention this afternoon. I'm lucky enough to be joined by 4 great people here on the panel. We're going to talk today about pilots and controllers managing change in an evolving national airspace system. And just briefly, Alex McDowell over here is a longtime U.S. Air Force veteran as the Deputy Director of Oversight for the ATO of the FAA. And more importantly, he and I have both owned Mooney airplanes. He had a 201, he has a 201. And since I'm a pilot now and can't afford to have an airplane, I no longer have my 231. And Brian Townsend is next to him. He is a technical pilot at American Airlines. And Brian actually has the unique pleasure of being the person that he told me 12 years ago, come to a meeting, Mark, it'll be great, you'll love it, and it's free food. I went 12 years later, 12 years of my life are gone. But Brian at the time was the NASMOD chair and the Air Traffic Services Group vice chair, longtime ALPA safety volunteer. When he got acquired by U.S. Airways and they made an acrimonious exit, he's no longer a part of ALPA, so he went across the street and became a technical pilot and has done wonderful work there with his ALPA background and his technical background. Andy Marosvari is a procedure specialist with the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and he's also a controller at Boise Tower Tracon. And Andy and I actually, I'm also a former air traffic controller, as is John Drexler, and Andy and I actually were hired by the FAA on the same day in 1806. So Andy is getting ready to retire next year, and if I was smart enough, I would have stayed in the FAA, and I'd already be gone too. But we appreciate him joining us. Then on the end is John Drexler, who is a United pilot and has done some terrific work for both the Continental MEC, the United MEC, accident investigation, just terrific overall work, and is our ATC director and is leaving us as he's retiring next year. So he's also getting out while the getting's good. So let's chat about what we're here to talk about today. When we talk about managing change in an evolving national airspace system, we're talking about changes in people, changes in procedures, and changes in threats. And we're going to start first with people. And we talk about a lot of new controllers and new pilots entering the system. And we have pilots that are changing airlines, we have pilots that are changing airplanes, pilots that are changing seats, or in Brian's example, a pilot who has stayed in the same seat with the same airplane, an A320, and watched while 3 different airlines went overhead, America West, US Airways, and American. From the air traffic control perspective, we have a younger workforce. When I was hired in 1987, I was 24, and I was the youngest in my class by 5 years. Now I would be probably the oldest in my class. They have better academic training than they did, and we'll have Andy talk about that in a moment, but they have some OJT instructor challenges, and it's a different setup where at the airline we are used to a check airman kind of situation where they take the 5 to 10% folks they think are the best instructors and teachers at the airline, and they teach, as opposed to in the FAA, it's a little bit different situation. I'll let Andy chat about that. But the FAA has a bigger challenge. The airlines are training people that already know how to fly, and we're just teaching them how to fly a specific airplane, whereas in the air traffic control world, they are literally taking people off the street with maybe no aviation background and basically teaching them everything soup to nuts about airplanes, airports, and how to control traffic. So it's quite a big challenge. So we see experience levels dropping, but Andy, I mean, how do we convey knowledge? Because one of the problems we have, we wonder, when you leave the FAA, the person who replaces you is not going to have the 31 years experience you have. And John, I would say to you as well, the person who replaces you at United is on OE now. How do we convey the knowledge that you've gained over that career to these new folks?
Well, honestly, it's just a question of mentoring as you go along. When you're operating a flight, try and show them the right way to do things. I mean, it's one thing when we get pilots coming out of training, they're fully qualified from a technical aspect, but they can't learn what only can be experienced when you get out onto the flight line. So when situations arise, it's up to us to show best practices and to show judgment. And they will learn that on their own as they go along and observe. You brought up the issue of common sense before. How common is it if you don't have the foundation and the frame of reference to make it common for you? When I was an air traffic controller, I've told you this story in the past, my supervisor would, while he was giving me instruction, would say, use common sense, John. Why would you do that? And I said, well, I wasn't born as an air traffic controller. This is not something common to my experience and to my frame of reference. It takes time to experience things and say, oh, now I get it. And yeah, that does make sense. That is common sense. It's common to this profession and to this vocation.
Andy?
Well, previous to the hiring requirements that the FAA had in place for the last few years, you didn't need any background in aviation to be hired as an air traffic controller. And since, well, it's been several years, most of the trainees that we get now are educated in some type of aviation background, whether they're a pilot, have a aviation degree of some type. So they come into the field with some background knowledge. But if you can imagine someone, even with an aviation degree, walking into a place like N90 or Southern California TRACON and having that wide-eyed moment when they see all the traffic and have no clue on how they're going to get through the program. That's why the training program takes as long as it does. We have facilities that probably train people for 3.5 to 4 years sometimes before they're a fully performing controller. The aviation background helps, but we found sometimes that someone without any background whatsoever will succeed at some of these facilities. The washout rate is still fairly high, but it's not a job that just anyone can do. So I do believe that the aviation education is helpful. I think we have a gap out there with general knowledge about aviation, but we're trying to overcome that with some of the training initiatives that we have. They have a program now where anyone who wants to go to New York Approach or N90 has to go to the academy and specifically train on sectors that are specific to New York. And the program just started. We don't have the results yet, but I think that will go a long way in helping staff that facility.
Brian, can you tell us a little bit, you and I have talked about since for a long time about tribal knowledge and the passing on of knowledge. Can you kind of share what you mean by that?
Sure, Mark, but before that, I'd like to think the legacy I left ALPA was you, and I'm pleased that you're still engaged and in a leadership role. So
We're sorry.
yes, tribal knowledge, and we have talked about that over time. I guess going back to the days when we were implementing RNAV procedures throughout the system, a lot of people felt that, hey, we've been flying RNAV for several years, and now we're implementing these various performance-based procedures in the system, and pilots will be able to fly it. And we learned the hard way that there was a certain amount of training and understanding that was lacking, and actually on both sides of the microphone for both pilots and controllers. It's taken many years, but through the hard work of ALPA and various pilot controller work groups that have been set up, much of that needed foundation for training, phraseology, guidance in the aim, and so on, has been put together so that that information is out there. Now, part of the problem is the training. I think some operators have done a better job than others over time with that training, but overall, the level has come up. Can it be better? Absolutely. One thing that American Airlines has started recently, across our fleets, we're doing more standardization in terms of some of the checklists and procedures across the fleets. And in addition, with our wholly owned regional airlines, that process is beginning, that many of their standard operating procedures, how they run their checklists, flows, and so on, will be identical to what we're doing on the mainline side. As those pilots transition and come over as the mainline carrier, it should make their training experience much easier, and their transition into that aircraft a lot easier than what it's currently been. So I think that's a step in the right direction.
Well, you know, we talk about conveying knowledge, and you know, it's interesting. Senator Tammy Duckworth was in here yesterday, and one of her comments that I absolutely loved, and she was talking about the conveying of common sense and sort of the big picture to, you know, pilots. And she basically said that one of her instructors essentially told her one day, "I can teach a monkey to wiggle a stick." And I thought that was particularly prescient because, you know, the technical skills can be taught to a lot of folks, but you have to, what makes a fully qualified and trained pilot is someone with the experience, the knowledge, the big picture skills to be able to apply that technical knowledge in the environment safely. And, you know, I bring it to light a point that Andy and I worked on earlier this year. We found the SkyWest RJ from Salt Lake City to Medford almost had an inappropriate meeting with Mount Ashland, which is a ski area outside Medford. And this happened because they were given a clearance that was inappropriate. Part of it's on the pilots. They had a chart that they could have reviewed, and they could have identified threats perhaps a little better. But the controller gave them a clearance that we've all been lulled into before. If we're given a cross such and such fix that are above 7,800, we have clear for the approach. We figured, good, we can go to 7,800 now. We're good to go. Let's go. And that was not the case in this particular instance. And so as a result, I brought this to one of our work group's attention, which is something that Brian and Andy and I work on together, and shared that. And Andy went back with NATCA and FAA, and they developed some training material that essentially would educate newer controllers, because this was a clearance that if you asked Andy, myself, or John, would we ever give an airplane that clearance? No, we would have never done that. However, some controllers don't see the big picture, aren't thinking a little bit, you know, ahead, and they have an incorrect assumption, and something bad happens. In this case, we got lucky. There was a fatal accident in Alaska a few years before that, and so we've identified, and NATCA and FAA have produced some training. But would you chat about that a little bit, Andy, and how that process was?
That was an eye-opener because for me, when I looked at that and listened to the description of it, it made perfect sense that the clearance should not have been given. But in air traffic control, at the rate that we are training people and the rate that we are losing experienced controllers, it takes about one generation of controllers that if something isn't taught properly, it doesn't get taught. It gets skipped. So I'm not calling out any particular controllers, but I think in this case, maybe that's something that may have been happening in that facility. And so post-incident, it's not about whose fault it is. It's about recognizing that we have an issue that needs to be taken care of. So we took action. We developed some training, recurrent training, specific to MVAs and approach clearances and approach plates, and we put that out there for the controllers to educate them, like Marc said. We don't want to have another incident like that, and we don't really care at this point who is at fault. We just fix the problem.
And that's one of the things when folks ask about, hey, where do your dues dollars go? Where do your safety dues dollars go? Where's the effectiveness of the ALPA or, for example, Southwest Airline Pilots Association or American Pilots Association, whatever it might be, you know, where's the value of that dollar go? It's the things like this where we can directly observe and affect change. So,
and Marc, I would just point out to dovetail off Andy's comment, it's not just about being an experienced or seasoned controller. If you change facilities, there will be local procedures in effect. Local tribal knowledge, if you would, that has to be passed on to the new experienced controller. We Just like we get type rated when we change aircraft, controllers get type rated in a new facility. So this is something that has to get passed on. I had a CTO at LaGuardia, it wouldn't be good at O'Hare. So just, again, it's just about passing on the knowledge.
And that's a great point. I mean, it's you think of it in terms of a type rating. I got a type rating for O'Hare. Now I've moved to someplace else. I have to get a kind of a type rating there. I go through new training and new requirements, and I have to be checked out. And literally, they call them check rides.
They're credentialed.
Yeah.
They're credentialed for a specific facility.
Yep, they're credentialed for a facility. They get a check ride, the whole 9 yards. Alex, I'd like to turn to you. When we talk about some of the challenges that we see on the line, I'd like to ask a little bit about kind of what are your challenges, and then also chat about we've talked a ton at this conference about data reporting. And how that can help. And I will tell you that every time I go to a meeting, or Andy goes to a meeting, or Brian goes to a meeting, or John goes to a meeting, we're continually asked when we bring an issue up, where's the data? So every piece of data that we can bring helps us. Can you chat about that a little bit?
Absolutely. When you're asking about some of the challenges, data is one of those challenges. First, to get it, but then when you're lucky enough to get it, how to visualize it, how to use it, what to make of it. I had the privilege of sitting in on your panel earlier this morning that was talking about data in specific. And a lot of that discussion was surrounding how do we identify where the next accident's going to be? And that's an extremely important thing. But I will share with you that that's not the only place where we use data and information that you provide through all the various reporting systems that you have. I'll just share with you an example that we talked about last week, Mark. We have standard wake separation for airplanes, right? Well, there was an effort to tailor some of that and make it a little bit more specific for facilities to optimize it, and that worked out real well for the specific airport that we did that for. It took into effect what fleet mix is there, what type of operations were going on, that type of thing. And so they were able to adjust what those standards were. And it worked out very well for the carriers there, so it got expanded to some other airports. So now you're up to about a dozen what we call wake recat airports. So now we're in a situation where you get unintended consequences. And some of those unintended consequences are, for a controller, he may be at a TRACON feeding more than one airport. Each of those airports have different separation standards. How does that work? It sort of isn't a standard anymore. So we've gone back and started looking at that again, and there's some efforts to standardize the standard again. That sounds kind of oxymoronic, but part of the debate is in the cases where we stretched out the separation, there are advocates that want to keep it that way, and other cases where we were able to tighten it up a little bit for more efficiency, there's some concern about that. And where we have found ourselves is we have a lot of simulation, a lot of the scientific work that's done, the simulation and modeling, and then we have practical reporting. I mean, because some of these standards that we're talking about are standards that we're using across the country at all the everything other than those 12 airports that I was talking about. And frankly, there are not many reports of incidences. Now, does that mean that they don't occur? I don't know. But if somebody's not reporting it, it appears that way, and so it leads us in that debate, but in the SRM panels and the debate between the scientists and the practitioners, which one are you going to put more weight to? If there's no reporting there, if there's no data there, the simulation and modeling is all you've got.
It's important to point out that in the data-driven world in which we live, if there's data, terrific, that says something. But if there's no data, that implies something. And that implies that that operation is safe. You may be in the flight deck flying from A to B and saying, oh my God, that was unsafe. But you know what? If you don't report it through a company irregularity report, an ASAP, if you're an air traffic controller, an ATSAP, NASA, any kind of venue, reach out to your Central Air Safety Committee. If we don't know about it, we can't deal with it. And so just as Alex portrays, there's so many things out there, and I can't tell you how many times, like for example, I've been rocked by wake turbulence. I got rocked 3 times by the same airplane coming out of Seattle a few months back. And, at the time I was, pretty excited about it. 4 hours later after I land, do I file a report? That's the question you want to ask and you need to be diligent about. And as we're seeing improvements with our iPad technology, the ability to report sometimes even en route, I encourage you, don't slough it off, take it seriously and report anything that you see. Anything that you see helps. I want to chat a little bit about, one thing I will point out briefly, and we talked with Steve Jangelis' data mining presentation earlier, ALPA is actually standing up a data protection working group to talk about all the data that's coming off the airplane. There is an unbelievable amount of data trending off the airplane to engine manufacturers, to the company, to a variety of vendors, and we're looking into that because we're finding that not everybody has the ability to effectively track that. So just as an aside, when you kind of look at Section 30 maybe of your collective bargaining agreement, you kind of look in there and that doesn't really reflect your current operations. But that's just one thing I wanted to point out. Alex and I talked about the SRMP process a little bit, which is Safety Risk Management Panel. The FAA used 2005 and determined that was a safe baseline system, and every change that came to the NAS after that had to have a Safety Risk Management Panel. I would point out that inside your airlines, that most of them have transitioned to an SMS environment, so every change they have goes through an equivalent type of review process. Can you talk about that just really briefly, and then I'll share a couple of ALPA experiences with that.
Yeah, you bet. What you're talking about, Mark, is in 2005 was when the ATO was directed to set up their SMS, much like all the carriers are doing now or have just recently done. So they've been at that game for 12, 13 years. So they started in 2005, and as you described, we felt like we had a safe system, and it was pretty difficult to go back and try to SRM everything that had already existed. So we baselined the NAS as it existed in 2005 and said, okay, we've got this safe system. Any change that we make to that safe system, we are going to do safety risk management for throughout the entire SMS process. And that's what's occurred, and that comes through our office. Not all of them. There are certain categories that we've delegated down to the ATO themselves. But for the most part, when you have initial high-risk hazards, when you have mitigations that cross lines of business within the FAA, those types of things, they will come through us and we'll review those. But I think what you were talking about is the panels themselves, and that's an interesting thing because I don't get to see that quite as much. But panels take on personalities very much the same way individuals do. And obviously what we would love to have is a perfect panel, absolutely prescient on every hazard that's out there and come up with rock solid mitigations for it. But the reality is each panel performs at a different level. And so that's something that we have to watch for.
Well, and this has affected us at ALPA. Most of these panels are very collegial. It's a great group getting together to work an issue, discuss hazards, and make sure it's safe before this new procedure enters the NAS. But there's been a couple of high-profile instances. There was one a couple of years ago with a Class B issue in Philadelphia that we weren't invited to the SRMP. It happens occasionally. It's not a perfect system, and a situation that we didn't think was appropriate was approved. They had another SRMP for a similar concept in Seattle a few weeks later that we jumped on, and we got the process stopped. And we said, hey, that's not appropriate, that's not safe, and that stopped it from being implemented downline. So there are, while the majority of these are completely collegial and everybody's on the same page and it's a great idea and let's go do it, there's occasionally some that shouldn't be done. A terrific example is 2 years, God, I can't believe it's been 2 years already. The FAA proposed on closely spaced parallel approaches that used to require 2 ILSs. The FAA proposed removing the requirement to have ILSs so you could have just 2 RNAV approaches without necessarily any vertical guidance. And we objected to that. And the SRMP just kind of was, it wasn't really a rubber stamp, but it was a steamroll. And so we didn't think that was appropriate, and we filed a non-concur with the outcome of that SRMP. It was the first time I can ever remember doing that or seeing that at ALPA from anyone. And FAA stopped the action, and it's interesting. Brian and I were just talking about this a few minutes ago. We're still working the issue, and ALPA's issue is rarely don't do this. It's usually, hey, have you provided the appropriate safety documentation, gone through the appropriate risk analysis or safety process to arrive at a logical conclusion? And if that hasn't been done, then obviously we object. And that was one of the few times that we've actually been put in a position to object. Let me turn the corner here a little bit. We've talked a little bit about our existing national airspace system, but we're entering unprecedented territory with new participants and new levels of complexity. One thing I want to talk about that was talked about yesterday on a panel was commercial space. And what we saw yesterday was terrific. It's unbelievably enthusiastic. I love seeing the videos like everybody else. It's wonderful technology. We had the wonderful experience of having Todd Erickson, the Vice President of Safety and Test for Virgin Galactic, in with us for the better part of 90 minutes to 2 hours in the Air Traffic Services Group meeting on Tuesday morning. I know it was a very well-attended session, the most attended session we had, I think. And it was really great to have the back-and-forth conversation with him and get everybody on the same page. We have some great subject matter experts working that, but commercial space has absolutely exploded. It is moving at breakneck speed. You see it on the news, all kinds of things. The problem, how does it affect us? Because we're on a different standard. We're not on the gee whiz standard. That looks really awesome. Let's go. We're on the, okay, we have to operate in the national airspace system. How does this affect the overall safety of the NAS, and what are we doing about it? One of the comments that was made that I heard a little bit yesterday was talking about airspace. At the moment, commercial space launches simply consume too much airspace. It conflicts with our operations. The delays we heard about, we saw the SpaceX launch in February from Florida. That particular launch resulted in 563 flights being impacted, nearly 35,000 additional nautical miles being flown by airliners, 62 nautical miles average per flight, almost 5,000 minutes of delays, and 5,000 square miles of airspace that was impacted. That presents some challenges, for us. We are trying to basically combine 2 disparate systems and take segregated airspace to integrated airspace. And I just wanted to get your comments and what you guys think about how that is moving forward. I'll start with Andy, because as a controller, how do you control a unmaneuverable aircraft returning to the surface with a defined trajectory and no ability to change?
You block a whole lot of airspace, which is inherently inefficient for the carriers that are being rerouted, and it also increases the workload on ATC because we've got to maneuver all of the airplanes over the same spot, basically. So it increases the traffic there, increased workload. It's inefficient to block airspace when it's not being used. We need to find a way to separate from the operation versus separating from airspace.
John, can you talk about the differing levels of safety and the challenges those present?
Well, yesterday I asked a question to Todd, and I had raised the issue of operating in a transitory hazard area, which will be the new type of segregated airspace that they'll be using for these types of operations. And I did note that in the NAS, we currently operate on a 10 to the minus 9, which is basically 1 in a billion chance of a problem. The space industry has 10 to the minus 6, which is 1 in a million. And in the transitory hazard areas, it can be 10 to minus 7, which is 1 in 10 million. And he did point out that, well, that's still a very high level, high margins here. But when you get down on a qualitative basis to analyze it, that's 1,000 times less safe than the current level we operate now. Or you can phrase it at a lower level than we operate now. We do have a mandate here that we operate at one level of safety. So it's going to be a challenge for us as an organization going forward to determine how we're going to mitigate that, how we're going to come to grips with that. Do we do it by continued segregation so we don't mix the current NAS traffic in with that type of space traffic? Do we find ways to lower our own levels but still consider it safe? So it's going to be a challenge for us. We're all very excited about this field, all of us. It's in our DNA as pilots to be for it, but we also wear a safety hat at this organization. And in spite of our own personal feelings and motivations, we have to look out for the safety levels, maintain those safety levels in the NAS. So that's going to be our challenge going forward, and it's better to do it now at this embryonic stage in our history than later on where it's growing exponentially, doubling, tripling, quadrupling, and so forth, and then it's going to be much more difficult to manage.
Andy, do we have the tools and the separation standards to handle this?
I think they're out there. They're in the process of working that at FAA headquarters. I know there's been panels talking about that, but it's something new. Instead of having one launch a month or every other month, we've got several going on every week now. So it is being expedited, but with that expedited process, we need to make sure we don't miss anything and that we maintain a safe system.
Well, it's important to point out, Virgin Galactic was talking about 100% year-over-year growth in launches, both passenger payload and military or commercial payload. And then SpaceX was talking about up to 5,000 satellites in space over the next 5 years. That would make me very much not want to be oversight. If I'm looking at how to blend this system, because from our perspective, we've worked hard to get a system that is a 1 in a billion chance of something horrible happening, and we're trying to blend in a system of commercial space launches that are 10 to the minus 6th for payload and 10 to the minus 7th for passengers. And they stated yesterday, and we heard this as well, you're not a passenger when you fly on a space vehicle now. You are a participant. And, my chief pilot, Scott Day, sent me a text yesterday. He goes, I want to start an airline for participants. How much easier would that be? And it's a whole different world. It's almost like when you go sign the thing when you go bungee jumping or river rafting going, I might die, but it's okay.
You will sign that.
Yeah, that's my point, and that's not quite the expectation that we have as potential operators in the NAS. And can you comment about kind of how we make these disparate safety objectives work?
It is a challenge. You hit the nail on the head. That's one we're working through right now. Andy was right. There's some tools that are in the pipeline, but unfortunately right now those are a little bit late to, I won't say late to need, but we could use them sooner rather than later, let me put it that way. In the meantime, we've tried to do exactly what John was talking about. How do you merge those and make it functional? On the launch that you mentioned, the original 10 to the minus 9th hazard plume, if you want to look at it that way, basically went all the way to London. That would have been a little bit challenging. So we had to go back into some of the mathematical computations that go behind that, and quite frankly, that's beyond me. I've got mathematicians to do that. But there are some assumptions that are in there, like for instance, the object transiting is stationary, as if it were a helicopter, and that's not exactly realistic. As an airliner is going through a particular area, it's obviously going to be a harder target to hit, if you want to put it that way, if it's moving. So they were doing some things like that, but all of that is temporary, I'll acknowledge. There is a transition period, And we're looking at the proposed launch schedules the same way you guys are, and that is a challenge.
Well, there's intense political pressure, from the commercial space industry. They've spent a lot of money and they want to see return on their investment. So that's a big deal to them, and we are sort of facing the brunt of that political pressure as we move the process forward. There currently aren't any standards, and I thought that Terry McVenis, our former executive Central Air Safety Chairman, who's now with Boeing, who was up here a few hours ago, made the comment that accidents are a poor measure of risk. And the lack of accidents doesn't necessarily mean that that operation is safe. And I can't tell you how many different times I've heard from the space community in general terms that basically says, hey, you know what, TWA 800, it had an in-flight breakup and it didn't hit any airplanes. And the Challenger broke up and didn't hit any airplanes. And even SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, their original contractor, Scale Composites, they lost an aircraft in a very public manner a few years back. And one of the comments that they made was, hey, it was a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. One of the things we learned is it validated our math on the debris field, which I'm both happy and sad to hear. But just the fact that we got lucky 3 times does not a safety case make. And so that's kind of some of the issues that we're looking at and we're facing. Brian, if I'm an air carrier and I'm looking at the potential threats from these space activities and the potential economic and operational threats, how do I address those?
Well, obviously, the safety has to be at the forefront, and those discussions need to continue. I asked internally what's the impact, what's our involvement with this whole process, because as we know, even though it's very exciting, it's exploding very rapidly. And
Bad term.
Yeah, bad term, exactly. But
Yeah, we're not going down, we're descending.
Yeah. Right. And yes, from an operational standpoint, the extra considerations that go into flight planning when a large piece of airspace will be impacted by the launch, potential delays, extra miles flown, from an economic standpoint, that has an impact on the airline, but also for the traveling public out there, the impact on their connections and overall travel experience. So we have to look at that side of it as well. At least from what I'm hearing, the airlines are very engaged in the multiple aviation rulemaking committees that have been stood up with the spaceport categorization and new entrance ARC has been stood up. I think there's one other, and there's various work groups involved. Airlines for America, that represents a number of the airlines, also co-chairs some of those groups, so that they are very much engaged in it with the regulations that need to be developed and to change some of the processes that are either currently in place and maybe don't fit the current commercial dynamics of what's taking place, and also to adapt to what is here and what continues to come in that particular program with the commercial space launches. In fact, with many airspace projects we've done over the years, we used to joke that this isn't rocket science, it shouldn't be this difficult to do. However, in these work groups, they're very specific. It is rocket science, and it truly is. But I'm more encouraged after what I've heard from some of the internal feedback that there is very deep engagement, and I think they're taking the right steps. It's unfortunate that we didn't get an earlier start with it, but and it may result into maybe slowing things down or taking some steps back if this gets too out of control. Because as I said initially, safety has to remain at the forefront, and we need to protect that at all costs.
Well, we've been told there's limited regulation in place unless there's a catastrophe until 2022 or 3. And right now, when there's these, airspace consumption at a launch, it's a negotiation between the commercial space provider and the controlling facility. There's not necessarily, there are not rules to this. And so that's what we're highly involved at ALPA. We've got a couple of great folks working on this project, and they're very intelligent people with terrific backgrounds in commercial space. And so our interests are well represented, but there's a lot going on. It's kind of an ongoing freight train, or it's kind of going like a rocket. One final point I'll make is when they put up the map yesterday, when they talked about the potential spaceports, one kind of important one they left off was Front Range. And it's important to know that they're contemplating putting a spaceport, in fact, they're already working on it, that will provide launch and recovery of space vehicles underneath the final to Denver International Airport. So I'm not sure about that. It sounds bad, but we have concerns about that, and we're following up with that. But just to let you know, there's a lot of things going on that we're not necessarily seeing on the front lines. That's what your ALPA safety volunteers are really heavily involved in. Let me pivot slightly. One thing that's gotten a great deal of media the last year and is on the FAA Air Traffic Organization's top 5 hazards list is wrong surface landings. Most of us have seen the video or the stories about the unfortunate Air Canada taxiway almost landing at San Francisco, where United's on the taxiway going, I think that guy's lined up on the taxiway. And my favorite is the next person behind United who just turned their runway, their landing lights on as though that was going to ward off the incoming airplane. But they went to 85 feet and they rounded out at 59 feet right over top of United before they went around. So that gets a lot of airplay. So, but I want to point out, as a result of that, there's been several actions taken, including a summit later this month. But Andy, did you want to talk a little bit about what tools have been developed to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Sure. Recognizing that we have an issue, and it's been increasing over the last few years, wrong surface landings, whether it be lined up for the taxiway or the wrong runway, but specifically to the taxiway, they're making use of ASDX, which is ground radar that's at many airports throughout the country, and they've been able to use that to look out on the final to determine if an aircraft is lined up for the taxiway. And they've done the initial test at Seattle, and it was very effective, and it's being waterfalled out through all the ASDX sites throughout the country. It will be tailored to each airport, to their specific geometry, but that's one of the tools that we're using to try to mitigate the risk of that.
Yeah, the taxiway arrival prediction tool that he's speaking of will provide an alert to the tower controller. And the tower controller, what do they do when they get that alert?
It's set at 3,000 feet or 20 seconds. If the alert goes off, it's a mandatory go-around for the aircraft that's lined up incorrectly. Originally, it wasn't going to be a mandatory go-around. There was going to be some latitude for the controller to determine if they could move the aircraft over to the runway, but that kind of takes away from the purpose of the alert in the first place. So it is a mandatory go-around if that occurs. It's
sort of like the use of our enhanced ground proximity warning system. In most cases, that's an automatic, we don't care, get out, figure it out later kind of concept, and that's what ATC is doing. But we show that to portray that there are some situations where we actually don't need data. They're so obvious and on CNN enough that we can see the issues, we react to them. There was 3 or 4 other high-profile incidents that happened at San Francisco that we researched and provided data on, and the FAA and NATCA together took action and put together a great tool that hopefully, as it's implemented over the next year or so, will solve most of those issues. Granted, pilots own part of that. You got to be cognizant. You got to be aware. You got to be, you got to be safe. But we try, every time we get a chance, we try to engineer every possible error out of the system. Finally, let me turn to en route datacom. That's coming later this year, and that's going to present a unique set of challenges. It's not always a common sense type operation, and it's relying on data from, data and procedures used from 30 years ago, and we're going to have to deal with that I would point that to John first. What do you think about how that's going to affect how you fly? And then I'll ask Brian the same question.
Well, primarily, those of us who are fortunate enough to do global flying are already pretty familiar with the whole datacom system using CPDLC, and for us, there won't be really too much additional training involved. The concern will be more toward the domestic pilots who don't have that exposure, and how will they be trained? You know, obviously we can't have them trained by bulletin. They're going to need some hands-on, and this system is going to be backed up initially with some test messaging to which you'll then respond with verbal responses, making a radio transmission. And it's really just proof of concept for the system. It'll act as training for the pilots involved as well as the controllers. So that's one of the things we'll be dealing with initially. It's going to be taking it to the larger cadre of pilots who operate domestically and aren't really comfortable with it yet or well schooled in it yet.
Actually, Andy, the controllers that are at these centers that are getting the implementation, how are they being trained?
It's mainly mid-shift or overnight operations, and they're doing a lot of practicing. And so there's certain carriers that have agreed to be guinea pigs in this program, and they keep sending messages back and forth, making sure that what was sent out was received properly and what was sent back is received properly. But Datacom and CPDLC is domestically at least, will be a complete change for controllers. We've spent years and years issuing clearances verbally and listening for the readback. Now we're going to text the clearance and read the readback. So I guess it would be a true readback at that point.
Yeah, it's the concerns that that we have is, we're going from completely a voice-dominated world where it's been the last, forever, now to an automated text messaging type of world. And how are we going to manage that? What happens if there's loss of contact? How we deal with those types of issues? But Brian, you've got a disparate fleet there. You've got people that are in A330s going all over the world, so they're used to it and going to Hawaii. I'm used to it as an Alaska pilot. But for those folks who are going, just internally within the United States, this is going to be a whole new ballgame for them. How do you go about training them?
Well, and I'm an example, with the Airbus fleet currently, narrow body, there is no datacom. So we have quite a mix, both international, domestically, because the 737s, most of the fleet has it. Those pilots are exposed to it. And as John pointed out, it's a big change domestically for the pilots. And I think the FAA's Datacom program has done a tremendous job of deploying the program first with the clearances. Now we're transitioning into the en route. Most of the airlines have their technical pilots involved directly in the program. So there's a lot of work and coordination that has gone into this. But for most of us here, we also know when it comes to an implementation, it's not always that smooth. And as you pointed out before, Marc, we're the ones that hear back from the pilots with the problems and, hey, what are you going to do to fix it? Within our work group that was mentioned earlier, the Pilot Controllers and Procedure System Integration Work Group, which we have several lines of business within the FAA that participate in that group, many airline technical pilots, NATCA, and so on. Currently, that is a group that is looking at some of these problems, and we are working with the program office to more clearly understand what the issues are. Some of it can be as simple as, hey, this is something different, and it takes a while to understand it and adapt to it. It's just like many other things that we've done in the system. But if we can identify problems that maybe you need to look at it from another angle, for those of us that haven't been as exposed in that project, it could bring some ideas to the table. But it's something that we'll all continue to work together on and try to make it as successful as possible.
I appreciate that. Alex, what's Oversight's participation in this process?
As the new technology comes on board, there are various safety documents that are presented and built and put through the procurement system. at the end game, the real piece that we have, we will monitor that as it comes along. But the real participation for us is when it comes time to put it into the NAS. That's a change to the NAS. And so that involves that more rigorous review of the safety panel. And it depends on those several things, and this certainly would, but those several things that I talked about that we reserve to review for ourselves, and that's any change in separation standards, any initial high-risk hazards, the mitigations associated with those, and any mitigations that cross lines of business. So depending on what comes out of that panel will depend on what level of involvement we have in that.
We've talked about, a lot of new things coming in, new people, new procedures, new threats. John, as we close up and get ready for questions, tell me why new isn't bad.
New isn't bad. It presents challenges, but it's, as I was saying earlier, we're all, when we come out of training, whether it's a 1,500-hour pilot or someone with more experience than that, we're all technically prepared to do this job and to do it safely. The challenges come in bringing the hundreds and hundreds of years of experience that are exiting from the profession and bringing all those salient experiences down to those new members who are coming in. That's where our challenges lie. We have to find the conduit, the most effective conduits, to deliver that judgment, that experience to those new members in our profession.
Well, and I encourage you when you're out there, when you're flying, whether it's with new pilots or new folks in the airplane or there's a controller in your jump seat, share the information you have. Part of what ALPA has going best for it is mentorship. I can still remember my first jump seat ride when I was an air traffic controller before I was a pilot. And you know what? I can still remember 3 or 4 things I saw during that pilot where I go, that was really stupid. I'm never doing that again. I'm never telling a pilot to do that, or that again. And that's the kind of way that we need to basically pass on the knowledge in any way we can. So with that, I would open it up for any questions that may occur. We encourage any and all questions. So.
Guess we did a good job. Nobody has a question.
I think we have a question on text.
Yes, sir. This is a question that came in text message. What is the appropriate method to report a wake event?
One of you guys can take that.
I didn't hear it. What was it?
Oh, what was the appropriate method to record a wake event?
I would think the first step you would take is to tell the controller about it. We've had this discussion when we've been working on the consolidated wake turbulence changes that Alex spoke about. So we had a lack of data. It doesn't mean that the events didn't happen, but they weren't being reported. So we encourage pilots, if they have an event, let us know about it. We will record that, and then we have the data. But if you don't tell us about it, we don't know about it.
Additionally, I would point out when operating out over the NAT tracks, whatever, we don't necessarily have a controller to tell right away. So what we'll do is we'll send a message to dispatch. We'll make a pilot report, and it's super valuable because he will then share that with people behind me who may be traveling on the same track or a parallel track and say there's an aircraft in front of you at this altitude on your track encountered this type of turbulence. And it's tremendously valuable information because other than WSI and an RPM track display, that's all you have.
Well, and that's, as we move forward, we're going to have to give that thoughtful consideration because as we move to a datacom world where the party line of I just checked onto the frequency, but I hear United ahead of me talking about thunderstorms or a bad ride or moderate turbulence, that's not necessarily going to be there anymore. And so we need to make sure that as we enter the datacom world that we effectively transmit what our conditions are. If we're fat, dumb, and happy, fine, but if there's any kind of issue that we might want to let someone know about, that would be great.
Mark, can I add
please,
on to that? We
please.
had an incident about a year and a half ago where there was a super overflying, I think the middle of the country someplace, and a regional jet passed beneath the super with the appropriate separation and had a wake event where a flight attendant or two were injured. The aircraft diverted to Omaha, but the controller, having that information, immediately went to the next aircraft behind the regional jet and offset them to the side to avoid another incident. So the atmospheric conditions must have been just right for that. We had the appropriate separation, but with that information, the controller made a sound decision to move the next airplane.
You know, we've talked a lot about automation. You know, we hear all sorts of things about remote towers coming in. Andy, do you want to just chat a little bit about, because, you know, we talk about single pilot cargo operations or single pilot operations in the future for, you know, for us in the NAS, but, you know, the rough equivalent of that is the unmanned air traffic controller for Andy. So how does that affect how you do business?
Well, for airports that don't have that service to begin with, that's probably an option. But as we see at Leesburg, the test facility for remote tower, we have an airspace issue. We're trying to mix operations that would normally occur in a Class D airport with Class E and G airspace. So that's a challenge for us. The tests are ongoing, and I think eventually we'll get there, but I haven't been out there to see that. I would like to go out and see it, but I can imagine it's not the same as looking out the window. So.
Well, the best part is it's unmanned. You don't have to go out there to see it. So,
True.
Alex? did
So
you-
I would hesitate to call it unmanned now, Mark. I mean, there's still controllers there. They're just doing their work by looking at screens versus looking directly out the window. And it is an ongoing test. There are answers that we're still learning as that goes on. But I think the point was well taken. That right now is targeted for those areas that currently do not have towered services. You know, we're not anticipating putting cameras up on the top of Chicago O'Hare's tower right now.
But that's in this country. If you
That's
go to
true.
the
That's
UK, for those of you familiar with London City Airport, which is their satellite reliever airport on the east side of London, they're redoing the terminal there, and as part of redoing that terminal, they're taking the air traffic control tower away, and they are going to have essentially a remote tower, and hopefully that will be manned. But they'll have a remote tower 50 or 60 miles away that will control traffic. And so that could be a camel's nose under the tent kind of event that could lead to a lot of things for our folks that operate in foreign countries and how they're going to manage that threat going forward. It's a different situation than what we see here in the United States
Right.
and what their expectations are. So,
Yeah, I think the way Europe's rules are different as well. I mean, you don't see as much VFR flying over there. You certainly don't see air carriers doing any kind of VFR or operations into untowered airports. I think there's a rule in several of the countries that you have to have a tower there to have an instrument approach. Of course, that's not the case here in the United States. So the ways that they are using some of those technologies are significantly different than the way we foresee ourselves using it.
John?
Well, as with the leveraging of all new technologies, ALPA's Air Traffic Services Group is trying to get out and lead and stay ahead of it and look at what problems can come down the road. We want to make sure, and we put this in our proposed Section 85 policy, that this type of technology isn't used to eliminate existing manned facilities, that it's not used to reduce staffing at ATC. Additionally, that we don't want it to increase ATC workload. I don't want to see a controller all of a sudden having to work multiple facilities from one location. Obviously, that could have negative consequences. And also, it shouldn't just be used as a cost-saving measure. If a facility is deserving of a manned, if a location is deserving of a manned facility, it should get one. From our perspective right now, where our thinking is at if a location wasn't going to have anything, this is okay.
Terrific. Well, if we have no more questions, we're pretty much down to the end of our time. If we've got a quick text question that we can answer, we're happy to do that.
Yeah, we do have one final one. It's kind of circles back to the discussion on the VNAV from an RJ pilot. And when the pilot typed the message, when I hear an ATIS saying that RNAV approach is in use, do I have to take it and fly a non-precision approach, or can I request the ILS?
I'll let John take that one.
You're the pilot in command. You never have to do anything you don't want to do. If you are not comfortable with procedure that's being advertised on the ATIS, request the procedure that you are interested in, the one that you are comfortable doing. That's all it comes down to in the end. Everything else is noise. You're the pilot in command, fly the procedure you're comfortable and safe flying.
Andy, are you cool with that?
I echo the same thing John said. If that's what you want, ask for it. A lot of times we will advertise an approach just for the sake of, I've lost my train of thought for a second, but so we know what to expect. So the tower knows what we're going to do. We can do just about anything. Now, it may require some extra vectors, but if that's what you want, we can make it work.
Great. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Marc, you're up.
Thank you to our panelists for the discussion. Thank you very much.